Thanks, friends. I say that because I know many of you, and as you're listening to my biography, I'm sure you're all thinking, yeah, this is how I fit in here. And there was, when I say I was responsible for overseeing the restoration of the Nightingale Brown House, there are many people in this room who walked that path with me, not the least of whom is Corey DeBoer. So when I suggested a topic to Brent about this talk, I said, well, let's just call it making a campus on College Hill. And that was some time ago, and so Brown's been in the news in recent weeks with plans about developing and expanding the campus. And so I thought, uh-oh, I'm going to run into a room full of angry people here. And so how about if I just say, in the 1950s? Because I think I should say, you will be astonished to know that Brown does not consult me about which buildings to knock down when it grows, which it must. And so I'd be glad to hear your questions about what Brown's going to do next and how it could be treating you so badly. But I don't have the answer to that because that's not what I do at Brown. I think about the history of the East Side and College Hill. And so I thought I might talk tonight about a time 60 years ago or more when Brown expanded into the neighborhood next to it, next door, and then it can take credit for helping to found the Providence Preservation Society. Those of you who are not laughing will understand that this is a joke, that there was such umbrage in the community after Brown was through that the Preservation Society was a natural outgrowth. So here is an aerial photograph from around 1950, and here we are on, let's see, here's Thayer Street, okay, and here is Waterman, and here's Soldier's Arch, and here is something called Brown University with University Hall here and Sales Hall and the flagpole and the green, and then here's something next door that isn't Brown University. So this really is an interesting time in Brown's history, which is, it started small and was small for much of its history, that Brown was here, and then Brown got to be here, and then we've drawn a design around this neighboring place of houses, and that is not Brown, but it's going to be Brown. Here is a page from the Hopkins Atlas of 1937. I think most people in this room recognize these insurance atlases in which every structure in town is identified for fire insurance purposes, and the little rectangles that are not colored in are wood buildings, and the red ones are brick buildings, and the brown ones are stone buildings. So this courtesy of the Brown University Archives. Thank you, Christopher Geisler from the John Hay Library. And here is Brown University in the center of this plat. If we were to close in a little, we would see here is Brown with Faunce House and University Hall and the John Carter Brown Library, surrounded in 1937 by lots of houses and other structures. But this is how we think of Brown as late as 1937 when this atlas was published. I mean, it was published incrementally or sequentially over the years, but in 1937, Brown was still within the confines of George Street, Waterman Street, Thayer, and Prospect for all intents and purposes. In this view of the campus of around 1908, we look down from an imaginary point of view at the campus that shows perhaps 20 or 21 buildings that are highlighted here, and out in this forest of undeveloped land, and as we well know, by 1908, College Hill was completely built out. So these are all structures around it, but for selling this print, the purposes of selling this print to alumni, these are the things we notice. Pembroke over here in the far, horizon. The John Hay Library existed only in drawings at this point, in architect's drawings. It had not been constructed, but because it was about to, why not include it? So here, here is a campus of 20 or 21 buildings that is Brown University in 1908, not that long ago. Oh, just in very shadow out here on the sides are the great houses that came up to College Hill to surround the campus, to be part of this. And so right here, actually, we see the Seth Adams house of 1854 was a duplex. It's got a solid wall running right up the middle with a house on each side, which Brown did not own when that drawing was made. Now houses the graduate school offices and other administrative offices. So it's a good, solid house. It's the kind of thing that surrounded the campus, but that you do not see highlighted here in this print. However, over here, behind what we will come to call Font's house, we do see some other little houses, kind of in the same ghostly way delineated there, just so we're kind of aware that Brown isn't entirely isolated in the wilderness like this. If we were to step into the quad and look between Font's house and Hope College, look through that little corridor, we would see these houses. It's one of the things that makes Brown such a congenial place, is the permeability of the campus. This is not some fortified campus like Yale with gates and walls. You just wander out through here, and Brown owns this building and does not own this building, and you're in the neighborhood. It's one of the great things about the Brown campus. Well, so if we were to look at a map of 1943 showing the Brown campus and that same area in the quad we saw, we could stand right here and look out again between Hope College and Font's house and look through and see next to the Edward Dexter house, this house, and with the legend Phi Lambda Pi. Oh, says, yeah, that's right. It's 1937 and Brown is surrounded by fraternity houses. 40 feet from the Brown campus is a fraternity over which it has no control, full of 19-year-olds, and that was life at Brown. And, it wasn't just the Lambda Pi here down the street from Font's Arch. Okay, here we are at Font's Arch, walking down Waterman Street. Here is Delta Upsilon, and this is my academic home here in American Studies. And here is Wilson Hall at Brown, now a university building, but in those years was a fraternity house. How about wander down below the John Hay Library here, Pi Delta Theta Alpha Delta Phi Zeta Psi. That's right. All these buildings that we see on the Brown campus that are home, they're now McFarland House and Garrard House, and home to our academic departments, were in the first half of the 20th century fraternity houses, including one or two that's under the site here of the List Art Building were removed. And so that's one reason that the Brown campus was as small as it is. Down at the foot here of Prospect Street, as it bumps into George, is Delta Phi. And now we call that Wilbur Hall. I mean, these are landmarks, but these were all lived in by undergraduates who all had enormous mortgages, and nobody was, paying forward to fix the roof 20 years from now. These were in various states of disrepair and in various states of fire code, And so this was a fact of life at Brown, much to the concern of the Brown administration, not to say the neighbors. Enter Henry Wriston. President Wriston, you see his portrait here in front of Manning Chapel and University Hall, was the strong leader that Brown was looking for. We'd had not a terribly powerful president in Clarence Barber, and whose health prevented him from exerting much control. We had a series of interim acting presidents. But when Brown hired Henry Wriston in 1937, all of that changed. Wriston was at Lawrence College, then president at Lawrence in the 1930s, and he wrote about forming character in young men, and not just sort of getting a college education with the part where you study physics and then go home and work in the family's mill, but how are we going to confront fascism in Europe? What are we going to do about the decay of Western civilization? And this was a burning issue for him. And one of his solutions was what he called educational housing. He thought that fraternities were the great way of bringing young people together to work on serious problems. Under his control, you might say. This is how he saw it. He wanted to set the ground rules. And so that sounded good to the corporation at Brown. And so in 1937, the very year that atlas was published, showing the streets of Providence, Henry Wriston came to be president at Brown. He understood about the value of historic architecture, at least in the terms that he knew. And one of his very first things he took on was University Hall, which was just this hodgepodge of retrofits. And he put the arm on John D. Rockefeller, the class of 1897, whose family had been instrumental at restoring Williamsburg and rebuilding Williamsburg, and got their architects to come up and make a great colonial building out of this much battered academy building. And so here we are in 1939 at University Hall, with what many people in this room might recognize as a total gut rehab. There is not one bit of fabric inside this building left. The ceilings are gone, the floors are gone, the walls are gone. All there is the brick shells. And so Perry Shaw Hepburn, the architects, designed sort of a colonial Williamsburg interior with fine paneling and elegant-looking staircases, things that had never been that elegant before. Brown had never been an elegant place, but it got real elegant in 1939 and 1940. So you might say that Wriston understood the value of playing to Brown's colonial past and appreciated architecture enough to have this building portrayed in his portrait when he retired. Well, so he, over the course of his first few years, went around to these 15 or 17 buildings. The ones that are outlined are fraternities. They're not owned by Brown, but they're full of Brown students, and said, if you will deed over your fraternity houses to Brown, we will take possession, and right off the bat, you won't be paying any more taxes, any more real estate taxes, because everything will be tax exempt in the city of Providence. But, and everybody said, oh boy, I can't believe our good luck. And over the years, this story began to be, and of course, we'll be taking over those houses, and you will be moving into quad that we will build that'll have, fireproof stairwells in it, and it'll have a refectory, and it'll have all these things that will make life more regular and safe, and we'll have evening meetings with the fraternity lads in which we'll talk about being a good citizen, and so little by little, fraternities began to turn over their buildings. So by 1943, these were Brown-owned buildings. Some of them made the cut. Some of them we sold. This one's at Wriston now. Some of them we knocked down. But the point was that that Henry Wriston imagined, and by that I mean not on his own, but he had with the Brown Corporation, he imagined this whole neighborhood becoming Brown also, and building a new complex here that would be like the complexes, the residential complexes at Harvard or at Yale. And so after World War II, we really had that question. Do we drop back and be just a great college? Do we become a Williams or a Bowdoin? Or do we kick it up a notch, in the words of Emeril Lagasse? Do we kick it up a notch and become a competitor and start eating Yale's lunch? And so we went for the brass ring. We kicked it up a notch, and we started building the quadrangle here that was very much like Yale, and it was educational housing. It was not only good for the neighbors to get all these kids out of the neighborhood, but it was good for society to train this next generation of young citizens to be serious people, to understand about the value of community, and to do it all under the watchful eye of Henry Wriston. So here we are. What does the caption say? 1948. We're looking down on Thayer Street again, okay? Thayer's here. Here is the quad here. Up at the top is University Hall. The flagpole is here. Here's Soldiers, Lincoln Field with the Soldiers Arch, the Memorial Arch. And this is the area in which Brown had started to land bank, I think as we call it, started to purchase houses in the 1920s. And little by little had acquired many of these, not all of them, but many of them, and thought this would be the place to put its new quadrangle. The neighbors seemed to have thought that was a good idea. There was some local concern about historic houses, but in 1948, the definition of an historic house was a federal house, a little wooden clapboard house. We didn't understand then, we didn't see it in the same way we do now about great Victorian architecture. So included among this collection of buildings is the Thayer Street Elementary School, a building by Alfred Stone, built in 1860 something. We'll get to the plaque sooner or later, and I'll be able to tell you, which was pretty well worn out. 80 years worth of elementary school students working that over. The street along Thayer Street had a lot of commercial property on it. We now think of the Thayer Street as being commercial upstreet, but downstreet it was also. So there is the Thayer Street School. 3 stories, or 4 if you include the attic story here. And the city of Providence seemed to be happy to swap. We said, we'll give you the land over on Brook Street make a new firehouse for the Brook Street Firehouse, and we'll trade you for this thing. And the city seemed to be glad to get rid of it. So maybe it had lived its useful life. So dedicated in 1868, Alfred Stone, architect. So
where is that plaque? Where is that plaque? Or is that when was that photograph taken?
About a couple of weeks ago. And the plaque is in the fraternity quad. Yeah, you walk down here, and there's a little gate that goes in right in here, and you'll see it.
What corner on Thayer Street was it? Thayer Street and Charles Field?
Charles Field. Yeah, Charles Field, Thayer. Okay.
What number? What's the street number?
There's no number on the street. It's who used to sell Hill House. How's that?
Oh, Hill House.
Yes. I know I'm talking to my favorite people when I say, do you remember where Hill House Clothier used to be? And yeah. So go to Hill House and face in the other direction, and there you will see, And so we started to build a refectory here, and underway when this photograph was made. So what did we knock down along here to make the refectory? Here it is underway. St. Stephen's Church, okay, George Street coming down to there. And get it while you can. Here is Benevolent Street, which will soon be thrown up and closed off. Brown Alumna Newsletter, 1949. The university has broken ground in the biggest building program in its history. 9 buildings are being torn down or removed to make room for the $1 million dining room. Ultimately, about 50 buildings will be removed in the area bounded by Brown, Charlesfield, Thayer, and George Streets, the location for the dormitory quadrangle. There's no sense of censure in this. Nobody is saying Brown is vandalizing the neighborhood. This is progress. This is post-war boosterism. Brown is going to grow. It's going to be a great place. We want to be in the middle of this great place. It's good for the neighborhood. It's good for Brown. You know, we don't see criticism. There's a couple of letters to the editor saying it's a shame to lose the landmarks of our youth, but everybody's pretty thrilled about it. Yes.
Do you have a sense of who lived in these houses? Were they rental houses? Were they owner-occupied?
By the time Brown got through them, they were rental houses.
So they were happy to see them go because they were probably run down.
Well, let's have a look. Brown had the presence of mind to document these things. It was the physical plant, had its own photographer, and went out and made these photographs, which are now, thank you, Christopher Geisler, in the archives at Brown University Library. So here we are on Thayer Street. Looking down, okay, here's our landmark. There's the Thayer Street Elementary School. And what treasures of American architecture are you about to bulldoze? How about Savoy Liquor Store, Hanley's Liquor and Ale? A couple of luncheonettes here. It's always been a commercial street. Not, you know, it was in the 20th century, it was a commercial street. Now, if we would turn the corner and look up the hill on Benevolent, there's the fountain and the Coca-Cola. Next door up is a dry cleaner working out of a basement of a house. And these houses looking up here are pretty modest. So when we get to the top of the hill, things will change. But at the bottom of the hill, nobody was lamenting the loss of these buildings. Here we are on our way up the hill. See Coca-Cola, right, on Benevolent Street. Here's the dry cleaner. And so the people who had been reading Antoinette Downing's book, The Early Homes of Rhode Island, were not looking at these and saying, how could you do this? You know, these were expendable for a better cause. So here we are on the corner of George, and there actually is a pretty wonderful house here, although I don't know anybody in 1950 was proselytizing for its survival. So this corner today looks like this. It is the refectory. You know, it was part of Henry Wriston's plan not to call it a dining room, as it was in the newsletter, but he called it the refectory, as we do it at Hogsworth's. And I should say that the undergraduates very quickly called it the Rat Factory. Refectory was good, but Rat Factory was even better. And today, when you go in there and say, where's the refectory, they have no idea. They say, oh, you mean the Ratty? Yes, the Ratty is over there. And they have no idea why it's called the Ratty, but it's a back formation of Rat Factory and Refectory. So. And then, on our way up the hill, here is this little village of fraternity houses that by pleading and browbeating and threatening, Henry Wriston had persuaded the fraternity men to move into under university control. Not a bad idea. You know, I mean, we're about to find out how this dorm works on Thayer Street, the private dorm across the street from the Avon Theater, something nobody has any control over at Brown, but is going to be taking a lot of grief for regardless, because it's going to be full of Brown students.
So, what was the enrollment of Brown, and what percentage of the kids lived off campus or on campus?
I don't know the percentage, but it was Brown was around 2,400 at this point, and no, and I don't know the numbers for Pembroke, but there were about 2,400 men. And part of what happened here is with this hard-charging president, the Brown became a more desirable place to apply to. And he was quite draconian. He said, when these applications come in, if we're not your first choice, you're not getting in. We're not going to be anybody's safety school starting now. And so it worked. You know, Brown started filling up, and that was part of the plan, just to get to a critical mass to make us masters of the universe. So here is that same view, right? Looking up George Street with our back to St. Stephen's Church. And when we started to say, well, I wonder if these things could be saved, we've been all reading the early homes of Rhode Island, and we know that these are early 19th century houses, and they're charming, and we wonder if we could save them. Nobody said that about this carriage house. You know, I don't know what the building associated with it was. It's right across from St. Stephen's, but I've never seen that name. I suppose if we went back to the Hopkins Atlas, who had listed the owner in 1937. But point being, who amongst us would not kill to have a condo in this carriage house? But it must have been invisible to the people who were clearing this land and making the refectory. So there it is down, we're working our way up Benevolent Street, and as we get up, the houses get bigger and finer and more detailed. And so when we get to the top, here we're at the top of Benevolent, next to the Anne Marie Brown Memorial, they're houses of this quality. So Clark Shuttle's question is, who lived there? My neighbor Ann Jenks in Seekonk lived in this house. Her father taught at Brown, and my guess is that starting in the 1920s, as Brown started purchasing this house from people who were moving out to East Greenwich or moving out to Rumford, that they started renting them to local folks, to university professors. Across the street is this wonderful house, probably invisible to people who cared about historic buildings at Brown. The caption says, the corner of Benevolent and Brown Streets, showing the names of the houses going down here. So they got better as they got up the hill, which will turn out to be an issue in a few years as we start down the other side of the hill and start knocking down more houses. But these were all sacrificed. If we look down Charles Field, there is a row of smaller wooden clapboard houses from the early 19th century, in the first third of the 19th century. And there were people who liked old houses and said, couldn't we do something about this? And Brown said, well, yeah, sure. If you look at this photograph, this aerial photograph from 1948, here is Charles Field. There are those houses. Here is the Goddard's house, right, with a wall going around it. And here, over just next to the Carrington house, it was a couple of empty lots. And then there's some tennis courts here. And so we took 4 of these houses and dragged them over and put 1, 2, 3, 4 houses there. Some were sold, some were retained by Brown. So here in 1937, are the houses. We called this then the Coates House next to the Anne Murray Brown Memorial. We called it the Faculty Club. No longer now, it's Health Services. And here are the early wooden houses that were small enough to move. Here are the tennis courts. Here are the windmill lots, so-called, next to the Carrington House. And so here, looking up Charles Field, is a house with a gable end to the road and a doorway over on the far right. And that got dragged over and put on a new brick foundation. So that was saved. And if you look here at the house next to it, just one downhill, with these shed dormers distinctive in this way, you'll see that house got pulled over all the way over to Power Street. And we drive by these things every day. You know, we see these things. So, with a little sign. Moved from Charles Field in 1949 with a new doorway or a different doorway. But that was about it, you know, with those 4 lots.
Is the one still there
Yes.
on Charles Field?
Yes, yeah, there's 2 still there. Yeah, we didn't need to take them all. Lawrence Roth, the longtime director of the John Carter Brown Library, lived in this house, loved the house, and Brown said, "Fine, take it away, because we're going to knock down everything here. We need this." Well, as it turns out, if we looked in close, in 1937, here on Power Street, down on the corner of Hope, there are 3 empty lots belonging to the Mary C. Wheeler School. And so Lawrence Roth's house got taken down there, and he got to live there. It's that house I just showed you, right? So this is this house. Professor Robert Kenny lived on Benevolent Street with his house with a great doorway. And so he was allowed to take that along also to the Mary C. Wheeler. You know, I mean, either Brown's going to pay to tear it down, or you're going to pay to pick it up and take it with you. So there it is. Professor George Downing and Antoinette Downing did not live in this building. They lived in another building, but this one was better, and it was going to be demolished, and so they got that. And that went down the street. So there it is on Power Street. So we were able to save 7 of these buildings, but a goodly number of them just got completely bulldozed. Yes?
How do they move these houses?
Well, you wait until the ground is hard. There's a good freeze, and then you put them on rollers. Sometimes you can roll them across a field, or there are special big, long trucks that have, they're low geared and have huge wheels they can move. And you just jack them up. You jack it up a 1/4 of an inch here, 1/4 of an inch here, 1/4 of an inch here, and you just keep on jacking until by the end of the day you're 4 feet off the ground, and then you sort of slide the truck in and off you go.
And moving down the street. They were always having houses moving down the street when I was in school.
Oh, uh-huh.
You see them.
Uh-huh.
Right, this can't go down this road, there's a house going on.
Well, Antoinette told me that they got this halfway there and got it jammed into a corner. It was Friday, it was late, everybody was exhausted and cold, and it was just jammed between a phone pole and a tree and another house. And the boss, guy, said, who just talked to his guys, and they all went back to Foster somewhere, and they said, "Okay, we'll see you on Monday." And she said, "You can't just leave this in the middle of the intersection." And he said, "Well, it's been my experience that they always let you come back later and take it out." So everybody went through and, got a good night's sleep and thought about it. And they came back on Monday and figured out how to unstick it and turn the corner. And but it has to be a little house. And some of these things were not little houses.
So of the 7 you mentioned?
Yes.
Was it 4 from Charles Field and 3 from Benevolent?
Yes. So across the street from the John Carter Brown Library is the Thomas Powell house. It's just too big to move. And it's a great house. And Perry Shaw Hepburn tried for the longest time to incorporate this into their residential quad. And it just, I am left to tell the tale here. This house which stood on this corner from 1865 to 1951, was originally the home of Thomas Poynton Ives Goddard, a Brown graduate of 1846 and a fellow who was given to the university by his widow, Hope Knight Hodgman Powell, in memory of her husband, Harvard graduate of 1910. So that plaque is all that survives. That's the plaque right there. And this is where that house stood. So here we have it, a quadrangle of new, clean, well-built, fire code meeting, controlled housing, and the neighbors are spared 20 or 17 fraternity houses out in the backyard. So, and this is where here is their drawing for something called the men's residential quad. That's what was known in that years. And here is how they tried to work it in, and finally just went ahead and without it. Here's the Wayland Arch into the fraternity quad with the quadrangle down at the bottom. Self-contained, no young men running wild in the neighborhood, and what could possibly go wrong? So that's the story. And so I would like to say that good night, and it's been great. With the fraternity houses here, you can see the fraternity letters on the front of each of these buildings, and the ratty down at the foot of the hill. But we were growing. And Henry Wriston, who stepped down as president in 1955, continued to think this would be a great idea. And what do you do with all the young men who are not in fraternities? And it's because as the school is growing, there's 32 little dormitories sprinkled around the campus, and little houses where people are, 6 people were staying. Maxey Hall had offices and classrooms downstairs. Up in the attic, there was another dozen students living in the same building. It's just a terrible way to house students, much less to have educational housing, to have moral housing. This is not, I'm not making the moral housing was what he described it, how he described it in his book in 1946, moral housing. So here he is with members of the Brown Corporation. Here he is on the bulldozer. You would think they would have the sense to turn this thing off for a posed picture, but no, look at this thing. This is fired up, and you just know that he's just going to put it in first and go. So, his plan was to move across the street. Okay, here we are, George Street. Here's the quad with University Hall. Brown Street. We're looking east here to the residential quad with the Anne Mary Brown Memorial, and looking west to a neighborhood that's nobody there, just vacant things. And here he is saying, the West Quad site, we can do it again and expand our campus and put another good dormitory in here, dormitory complex, to take care of the growing number of students who are attending Brown. Well, turns out that when we look at the aerial photograph, there are buildings here. It's not just a green rectangle. Here, do we see where we are? It's the same view. Here's Brown Street. Here is the new men's quadrangle. And here is what we were proposing to dispose of with the Unitarian Church at the bottom of the hill. Well, several things have changed between 1948 and 1955. And one is that we have now begun to understand what it's like to live next to a large institutional complex. And the folks in this neighborhood found that that was a mixed blessing. And another is that when you get up from the bar in the garage over here in the Hanley's Ale and get up to the top of this hill, the quality of the housing stock changes. These are serious houses, and one by one, Brown was acquiring them from the neighbors, but it was also horrifying the people in the neighborhood. So, and by that I mean down where are we? Looking for Charles Field.
Yeah, you were over.
Thank you. Okay, looking down Charles Field. The foot is Beatrice Chase, who had a lovely house down on the corner of Thayer. John Nicholas Brown, the secretary of the corporation for Brown University, loved historic architecture, loved Brown University. He was right in the middle of this. His family house, where he and his wife Ann Seddon Consolving and their children lived, was one block over. If you get the idea here, this is what we used to call the Bishop's House. Here's the Rhode Island Historical Society John Brown House here, and the next block over was his great wooden clapboard house. But most of all, the person who had the front row seat for this, the people were William Slater Allen and Elizabeth Allen. So here is McGee Street coming through, and here is what is now the Brown Faculty Club, and here is the Allen's house. Right? The ancestral home. That's the Allen's house. So they had a front row seat to looking across to the site here. Now, here we are back in 1937, Benevolent Street, McGee Street. Here's what is now the Faculty Club. Here's the Unitarian Church. And so in their backyard, they had their neighbors were Beta Theta Pi and Alpha Tau Omega and Gamma Delta something. So they, I'm sure that there was a good day for them when Brown University took over these buildings, and then subsequently when the fraternity men moved over to the new fraternity quad. In 1955, this was the Allens' view. They looked out across the street. See where we are here? They're looking out the front door of their house at these houses, okay, looking south. And this is, in 1955, this is their view. In 1956, and I know what you're thinking, which is that I've put in the slide of Berlin in 1945. But no, here is the Anne Marie Brown Memorial. Here's what was then the Faculty Club, now Health Services. Here's the Bishop's House. Wow, is right. So you see these little corners for the scrapbooks here? This is the Vi Gowdy notebooks of the Preservation Society. So this photograph exists nowhere else other than in the domain of that cadre of volunteers who went out and photographed these things. This was her street, and the Mrs. Allen and Mr. Allen were going to have to get used to the idea. You see the sign nailed on the tree. This is Brown Street, and this is Benevolent Street going down to the church, right? And they were going to have to get used to this neighborhood disappearing and looking like this. Same architects who used this same kind of colonial Williamsburg look, and with the same justification. The students are safer, the neighbors are less bothered. The dining hall is not left to chance about whatever you're going to be cooking, and the food safety and everything is better for the students. It's better for the university. The question is, how are we doing with the neighbors? We're back on the corner here, Benevolent Street, Brown Street, looking down the street, down toward Powell in Charlesfield. This will become, this is some of the street houses along that street. And they're pretty nice houses, I think, by any standard. And say goodbye You know, this is what it looks like now.
Did they move any of those?
They did not. The question was, did they move any of those? And the answer is no. Some were too big. Here's the Kilvert's house down on Charlesfield. And just too big to move. So it looks like that now.
These were really cheap to build, even at the time.
The dorms.
Bare bones. There's no decoration, the hallways, all
Uh-huh.
the construction details. These were ultra cheap.
You know, I just remember there was, at this time, Brown put in a bid for the Poor Farm up at Dexter Asylum. And it could have gone to the real estate developers who wanted to extend Diamond Place and that neighborhood through there. And Brown, you know, so there were sealed bids, and the sealed bids came in 600,000 and 450,000 for 39 acres of farmland in the middle of College Hill. And Brown win it $1 million. And they thought, somebody else is going to build $1 million, but you know how this works on eBay. So you go back and you goose it up a little. So they sort of, you know, got to 1,100,062 or something, just so they, you know, wouldn't get caught at a round number and lose it by $1, and won it. And people came back to the president and said, "Where are you going to find $1 million? You have any idea how much that is? Nobody's got $1 million. This is nuts. What are you going to do? You're going to have to sell this back to the developers." And it was quite a fight with President Keeney. I'm sure it was true. $1 million was a lot of dough. But Brown was never a terribly wealthy school. So, you know, Eric, I think he's got the point here, is that it's, you know, we didn't have a lot of extra money. But I had not heard that about those dormitories. Well, so here we are on, where are we? Thayer Street, George. Okay, so here is Brown Street coming down from the John Carter Brown Library, right? And coming south. And there is a fraternity house, Sigma Nu. Now, at this point, Professor Bill Jordy had joined the art history faculty, the architectural history faculty at Brown, and the committee of people that Brown appointed to think about these houses and what we could do with them, how we could save them, had a different tone. And so you read the caption to this fraternity house photograph, and it says, you know, it's the Shepherd House in Charlesville, Greek Revival house with exceptionally luxuriant wooden ornament, probably derived from Menard Lefevre books, in other words, the pattern books by the 19th century architect. And we realized that we had a more sophisticated understanding of our architectural heritage. However, the Sigma Nu guys had run it into the ground. It wasn't worth saving, at least so Brown thought, and so it soon became a parking lot. Yeah, and so here's the house on the corner. We'll turn this corner and look. This is the very house we just saw from downhill. Now we're seeing it on Brown Street, and here is an architectural description. Baldridge House. It reflects the influence of John Holden Green. And we see at Brown this nascent understanding and appreciation for the history of this architecture and the understanding of it and the complexity of it. But it's still lodged mostly in 18th and early 19th century examples. Well, one of the other things that's changed is let's find the vacant lots here. You know, here's Wriston Quad, here's about to be the new quad, and all those 7 slots are now filled from 1949 and 50. And so the committee that included people from town, people from the neighborhood, people from the Brown faculty and administration started looking for vacant land anywhere. And they said, oh, look, here's an acre out behind the John Brown house. Maybe they'll sell that acre so we can move some of these houses over there. You know, that didn't happen. But there were no more buildable lots close enough to move any of these houses. And besides, most of them were big, grand houses, bigger and grander than the ones we saw down on the eastern side of the slope. So this street view will become this. And the photographer for the facilities department at Buildings and Grounds at Brown seemed to understand what was going on here and the loss of these buildings. And Brown owned them. Brown was free to do what it wanted. There was no zoning prohibition about knocking these things down. So when he made this photograph, he marked himself very carefully with the elm tree in the foreground and the steeple in the Unitarian Church, because this was the iconic view. This is the other one besides Betty Allen's snapshot with her Woody in the front yard. This is the one that we just go, oh my. You know, this is the treasures of the East Side going into that dumpster. So, well, you can imagine the effect this had on the neighbors. Be one thing to have peace and quiet, but another thing to lose wonderful houses in the right in your view. And we knew things. We didn't know. I mean, we didn't. A generation before, or a very short generation, in the 1940s, everybody was much more accepting about the idea of letting Brown have its way, because it was good for the community, it was good for Brown, and therefore everybody won. But there was a feeling amongst many neighbors that Brown had really reached too far, had overstepped. Not because it was the wrong thing for Brown to do. It's just, we use the shark analogy. The shark stops swimming and dies. We don't want to have a stagnant university. We want to have a dynamic university. I don't want to work in a great school for the 1990s. I want to work in a great school for the 2000 teens. And so we have to move forward here. It doesn't necessarily mean growth, but it means the physical plant changes. Well, we hadn't got here yet. Here's the Providence Journal from last spring talking about the houses right in this neighborhood. This is on William Street. Is this your house? No. Next door. Okay. Okay, it's your gate. Okay. So, thank you. Okay. So, we take it as a given now. I mean, this is, it's a international draw. People can't wait for the PPS tour to come from around the world and see this thing. But we weren't there yet. But this is how it started. People like John Nicholas Brown, who chaired or presided over the Preservation Society as a founder for years, while he was also chairing the what we now call the Facilities and Design Committee at Brown. Was also presiding or chairing over the Providence Preservation Society, articulating what it was about the neighborhood that was good and worth saving, and putting in some system of evaluation and accountability. People like B. Chase, people especially like Betty Allen, thank you, who were, and many of people in this room worked with these folks and knew how this story developed, how we developed a College Hill plan of a demonstration of historic area renewal conducted by the City Planning Commission and the PPS and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So when I said at the beginning of the talk that we could thank Brown for the PPS, I think what I meant was that was just the last straw. And the PPS was forced to become a reality, and to everyone's great benefit. Because Brown continues to grow, it evolves, it becomes a stronger place. but we do it now in conjunction with the community. And here's an example of a little tiny house. Just in closing, I thought I'd throw this in because we went to a nice ribbon cutting last week, and there it was. It's a little tiny house on Benevolent Street, and for years, Brown would have bulldozed that thing in a heartbeat. But we didn't. We fixed it up. Fixed it up with the consultation of the Providence Preservation Society. Go out back, and there's an historic plaque that the Preservation Society assisted with. So the house was lived in at one point by Edward and Christiana Bannister. So Brown owns it and will sell it to somebody on the staff with a provision that it be sold back to Brown if they ever leave. But these years are over. So here's where the story ends for now, is that we don't go in and demolish a block of historic houses this way. Brown continues to remove buildings and continues to build new buildings. But now we do it in consultation with some of the folks in this room and with a long-range plan. And so we are not where we were 60 years ago. It's a great time to celebrate the Preservation Society's 60th birthday, because when we see a picture like this, we know how far we've come. Thanks.